Okay, hello everyone. So we are here for our second roundtable of the day, and this one is called Sustainability Checkup. So again, my name is Mariel Ibrahimi. I'm the founder and CEO of Disrupt CRE, and today we have yet another amazing panel. I'm not biased, just kidding, I'm super biased. And I'd like for everybody to just go around and introduce themselves, and then we can jump into the conversation. So Mike, let's start with you.
Sure. Hi everyone, Michael Daschel. I'm Senior Vice President of Sustainability for Brookfield Properties. I work on our ESG strategy for our New York City office group and our national renewable energy procurement strategy.
Hello, my name is Jessica Francisco. I'm the Global Head of Sustainability for Cushman & Wakefield on the occupier side of our business. I've spent the last 20 years in both corporate and consulting roles within sustainability.
Hi, my name is Dave Power. I'm the Director of Global Innovation at PGIM Real Estate. High level, my remit is to find best-in-class technologies that are out there to solve some of the problems that our business needs need.
Hi, I'm Cindy Mclaughlin. I'm Head of Product at Carbon Built. We make a technology that enables the production of very low-carbon concrete products, starting with masonry. For the last 5 years or so, I've been running a commercial real estate tech company focused on zoning, so I come at it from that perspective as well.
Hey everyone, I'm Ryan Baxter. I wear a few hats, including serving as prop tech advisor to the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, where I help them design and implement energy efficiency and decarbonization incentive programs. Excited to be here.
Thank you guys. So I've had the pleasure of knowing some of you for quite a while, and some of you were meeting for the first time, but we had some really, really deep and interesting conversations in prepping for this roundtable. And part of what came to light was kind of the disposable nature of our culture today, whether it is single-use plastics, fashion, and even the way we build buildings has changed quite a bit. So we are here to talk about how we can build a better built world, not only for us and people who care and are passionate, but for the next generation of innovators and the people who work in buildings and live in buildings and go to school in buildings. And I want to start by setting the stage of how did we get here before we talk about where we are today and what are the principles at play that are driving change in sustainability initiatives. Give us some context for how did we get here? What are the core elements of our industry that led us to this moment? Who wants to kick us off? I know, don't all jump at once.
All right, I'll try. So I think of this primarily as a spatial problem. We have an enormous misallocation of space in our countries, in our cities. And it feels as though it stemmed from the 20th century when we had the automobile revolution. And, Robert Moses and the other leaders at the time really sucked people out of cities and into suburbs because they enabled all this car infrastructure. So they built highways to allow people to set up shop in the suburbs. We built our train stations even at the time, or our train infrastructure, to bring people into Manhattan and the central business districts and then back out at the end of the day. And so at the end of the day, as a country, I think we need to start sucking people back into cities because that's the most sustainable way to live. As cities, we need to think about creating mixed-use sustainable neighborhoods where people can walk or bike to their daily activities, like the 15-minute city. And then as buildings, we need to think about 24/7 use. So we're using them during the day for one thing, and we're using them at night for something else. So we're really, it's reuse, reduce, recycle, or reduce, reuse, recycle. I would finally add, when we need to build, it should certainly be with very low carbon materials and, all electric and so forth. And when we need to demolish, we should start thinking about how to demolish so that we can reuse all those building materials in our next building. All right?
Thank you.
I'll stop.
And that is definitely one kind of perspective on the full picture of what brought us to this moment. But it's a really, really important one. So thank you for painting that picture.
I'll add, I think we've had a limited sense of urgency for quite a few decades now as a country. We have slowed down how quickly and how large we build. We have not brought forward some of the learnings we've had from our great cities of increasing density. We've known about rising sea levels meaningfully since the 1970s, and only recently are we seeing major stakeholders in the built environment collectively deciding that they have to take a more personal role in addressing climate change as a whole, making it much more core to their businesses as a key differentiator, something that can help them outcompete their peers when it comes to things like institutional investment dollars. That shift, I think, has led us to this position now where, in many instances, it's governments and public entities that are setting the goals and standards that the private sector is adopting. And hopefully we'll see private sector folks, such as the ones we have right here, demonstrate that we can go even further beyond what governments are requiring as we prove what's possible in decarbonizing our built environment.
Well said.
So I have a little bit of a different opinion. I don't actually think everybody needs to live in a city. I think we've gotten to the place where we are because we thought everybody had to go to an office every day to go to work, to make a living. What we're seeing coming out of the pandemic is that's not the case. So I think we need to match jobs where people want to live and recognize that not everyone wants to live in a large urban center and be responsive to what's out there. So I think having a more agile, flexible approach to how people live and work is where we need to go. We have had a very set standard in the past. And then secondly, our infrastructure. We have not made investments in our electricity grid and other components that we really need to electrify and decarbonize the built environment. And I think, we've and it goes beyond just the electrical systems that we have out there. But I think we need to start to just be much more agile about what work and life looks like.
I love that. Dave, do you have something you wanted to add on this point?
Everyone's given really complex and really interesting
I wouldn't want to
answers.
follow those answers.
How do you follow that one? I think it's really interesting. It's a super interesting topic. I think if you go back 50 or 100 years, like you said, you go back to the advent of cars or Henry Ford or whatever it may be. I look at things, obviously I'm a bit of a tech nerd, so I look at things from a technology perspective. So I think technology, when we come to recycling and stuff like that, and single-use plastics we talked about, I think plastic was an amazing invention. I think technology was a leap forward, but it was probably a leap forward for the wrong reasons, right? And I think as we advance now, like you said, there is an urgency towards, all right, how do we make ourselves more green, more sustainable? I think there's a focus on it across that spans generations. And I think, both public and private now, it's very much in the forefront of everyone's mind. And I think technology may have got us into certain cases with plastics or whatnot, but I'm a firm believer that technology and innovation will be a driver to get us out of it. And I don't just say that because I work in innovation for a real estate company, but I believe that we can do that. Do I believe everyone should live in the city? From a green perspective, yeah, that would be great, but what we've seen is not everybody is looking and driving for the same thing, and I think, some people will want to live in suburbs and always have done. I think, can people adopt green approaches no matter where they live? Yes, absolutely. I think, as we strive to go forward, what's funny to me is we tend to be backward looking now, right? It's, well, what happened I used to call him a milkman, it's probably a milk person now, but you would recycle glass all the time, right? And you would recycle all the time because you didn't have cheap materials, and now materials are being used up. There's a scarcity, so now we can't use that. So concrete, okay, well, what can we add to concrete to make it greener? And this is true for all materials. So I just think it's a really interesting topic, and you could, like I said, go back hundreds of years to figure out what one person did at one point in time that may have altered this, but can't look backwards now. I suppose we need to start looking forwards.
Absolutely.
And what can we do to alter them?
It's a moment for looking forward. Absolutely. Mike.
I just want to add one of the major themes I think that got us here is the kind of advent of the data and the just flood of information that we didn't have before. I think with that, it creates transparency, and once people start seeing things that they weren't aware of before, it starts really driving change. And so you might have tenants or investors who are invested in real estate and suddenly are aware that the real estate that they've been investing in for decades is not good real estate. Like, it's actually harming the planet, right?
Harmful.
And tenants may realize that the space that they occupy all of a sudden is not clean space, that they're not using their space wisely, that they're wasting resources. And until you had that data available and the technology available to really interpret what was happening, I don't think this was even on most people's radar.
It wasn't, right? Until it became important to tenants, to shareholders, and all of a sudden we're starting to see movement, we're starting to see new careers emerge to focus on these things, to identify challenges and how technology hopefully can move us forward amongst many other factors. So bring us to this moment. So in this moment, in 2022, not only have we had many years of making this more of a priority, but we've also had a rapid acceleration of technology development and cultural change due to the pandemic. So, what are the major drivers for change right now? Because we could speculate, but you guys are on the front lines. So what is driving change right now? Mike, if you want to start.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, the stakeholders becoming engaged in a way that they never were before. So,
tell us loud and proud.
For example, I would say 2 years ago, there was not a single investor that would ask me about ESG.
Wow. Before 2 years ago, you said?
2 years ago.
Wow.
None. And I've been working with JV partners and funds and everything in our properties for 8+ years at this point. It was never brought up. And so we had 2 years ago, the first investor was like, well, show me your ESG report. I'm like, well, we better build one of those.
Whoa. Wow.
And it's not like things were not being done that are categorized under ESG. Like, we would do sustainability efforts. We had philanthropy programs. We were engaged in the community. But it was kind of bringing it into this overarching umbrella that said, I want to look comprehensively at your business and understand what you're doing from an ESG angle. They kind of changed how we're thinking about it. And now, to Ryan's point about competing for those investment dollars, investors are more discerning, tenants are more discerning, and now they're going to start vetting the spaces they occupy and the businesses that they invest in on these criteria that are becoming more and more stringent, more and more visible. And I think that's really driving people to change how they're doing business. Now,
I love it. Do developers love it? Are they excited about this? Is it something that we're just kind of being naturally, to an extent, of default because culture is moving in this way? Like, we're making a better opportunity for these initiatives, or is it also just good business? Anybody?
I've worked with corporates for the last 10+ years. It is good for business. They're following the money. Even during the pandemic, when the stock markets dropped, companies that had a strong ESG value proposition outperformed the market, rebound more quickly. So there's a confluence of drivers, but for many, it's money. It's investors and shareholders. They're avoiding the shareholder referendum. They're seeking more favorable interest rates when they go out to borrow. And they're also, looking to make money from having more sustainable products and services. The Gen Zs and millennials, they will pay more for more sustainable products. They will take jobs that pay less to be connected to something that has a positive social and environmental impact in their day-to-day. So and it's all ties into, there's so much data out there, people are finally able to bring it together. But companies are making money off of it.
That's profound. Truly, that somebody would take a job that will pay them less for the sake of working in a role that is, making that a priority.
Yep, and it's one of the key things people are thinking about, particularly in the war for talent today, is how do I make them connect it to not only what we're doing as a company, but the positive impact we're trying to make.
And I know you work on the occupancy side, so I saved a lot of the office roundtable questions from before around sustainability. I was like, hold on, we got a roundtable for this. So I appreciate that perspective a lot. Cindy, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll note what I hear from a lot of my commercial real estate friends is that they're experiencing a whole bunch of extrinsic stressors. So everybody wants to get there. And at the same time, they're dealing with rent control for residential, right? So they're struggling, I think, to maintain margin on their residential properties. They're experiencing the risk of stranded assets for their office spaces. So unless you've got great Class A office, you probably are struggling with your Class B or Class C. And they're being hit with sustainability regulations from the city and pressures from tenants and investors. So, we're in a moment, I think, where we need to, the city, the state, the country needs to step in and help landlords make it through this period so that they can, see this as exciting and not as just stressful.
Yeah, Ryan, let's hear from, we just entered the policy making chat. Let's hear about it.
Well, before we go there is one additional area that I do want to focus on for good business aspect of this, because 2022 is very much following the prop tech revolution. Over the last 30 odd years, prop tech has been percolating, and now we're seeing the leaders in real estate expand their more traditional corporate development functionality to also include prop tech focused VC. This has created a new way to justify many of the hardware upgrades that are part and parcel to a proper ESG strategy, because now, in addition to having the carbon benefits to use to justify some of these improvements, some of the more nimble, agile real estate firms are also able to benefit from helping these solutions scale within their portfolio as investors in the company. To the policy bit, I do think this is where public entities can play a very large role in convening stakeholders, in establishing standards to foster the conversations that need to happen, because historically there's been a split incentive issue in New York City real estate in particular, where a real estate company might be concerned about rent de-escalation from improving the operating expense of a given asset, and thus may not have been as proactive in encouraging tenants to work with them to improve overall building performance. And in a place where rents are very high, it's hard to use just pure energy as a justifier from a ROI perspective. And so having a public entity that can bring people to the table, help establish the standards that can ground conversations, help make the point that, certain things should be treated like your janitorial services, where it might be hard to evaluate the simple ROI, but it's nonetheless part and parcel to how you provide the experience your important shareholders expect from you.
I think you said quite a bit there. Cindy's going to unpack it for us.
Well, so I don't know if I'm going to unpack it, but what I'm not seeing is a lot of money coming to the table
for landlords to be able to do these retrofits, to be able to maybe convert their building to a much needed residential if they have office, and in the process actually do an energy retrofit. And so I am interested in public policy that actually is supportive of this so that we can move more quickly.
So I think, I don't know if it's necessarily public policy, but when I see the issue is everybody's trying to solve this issue alone. And there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration that doesn't necessarily have to give away competitive advantage. So for example, one of the things that they do in Europe that's so much better is they do district heating and cooling. So rather than having to change that to renewable building by building, they're doing it for an entire central business district. So I definitely think there's some policy elements, but we also have to get people collaborating and working more seamlessly together, because there's landlords and tenants, they have a lot of shared goals right now, but they're approaching it very differently, not necessarily realizing those synergies, and it's from building into building as well. So I think I'd like us to see how we get that policy and that support to start to move and change things, not building by building, but through central business districts and other things.
That's such a great point.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity on the tenant and landlord partnership in that collaboration effort. I mean, and again, to the data and the information sharing, so many times, in New York, we're lucky, most of those office spaces are subleased, but we don't have visibility of how their infrastructure is actually set up within the space. And there's no kind of agreement that's really standard in most leases right now that says that information is going to be shared, although it's emerging slowly. And I think even from the tenant side, that's now become space that most companies are going to start reporting on from like a greenhouse gas emissions perspective. And so they need to understand how their building's performing because they are responsible for a component of the emissions that are generated by occupying that space. So there's a lot of two-way information that can benefit both parties there.
So, did you want to jump in, Dave?
No, I was just going to give everyone a round of applause.
Right, that was really amazing.
No, I fully agree with everything you've said. I think policy is certainly an issue. Having a North Star that, let's say, people like us could follow, because there are an awful lot of different standards that can be confusing. And when something is confusing like that, no one makes a decision. Couldn't agree more on the collaboration between tenant and landlord. I don't even like landlord and tenant as a owner and occupier. I'm seeing a lot of technologies out there that will help everybody, and what we're trying to get at is if we can, that goes back to your point with data, if we can start sharing that data and being more collaborative, because ultimately we have to be, right? It can't just be, okay, the landlord's going to do it. Yeah, they're going to try, but there's a lot of headwinds there, right? So I think that openness or transparency with data that we're seeing through BMS overlay systems, through whatever systems that are there, I think if you start sharing that and educating the tenants, saying, look, we can make the building unbelievably efficient with HVAC units and different sort of new technologies and beacons, etc. But we also need kind of you to play a part. Like if you just leave all your doors open and HVAC running all the time, and it's really to no burden of you potentially. It's you're wasting energy essentially. So I think I agree with all the points. I think it's a collective effort, and there's not one person that can shoulder all of it.
I just wanted to add one thing on the data. So I worked at PG&E on energy efficiency programs for a while, and we spent a ton of money counting savings that could have been so much better redeployed. And we're talking tens of millions of dollars every single year. So we have to think about a way to get the data, share it, and recognize all of this as estimates and get it as accurate as we can, but not make perfect the enemy of good enough, because so much money is wasted counting things today versus doing. So I hope we can start to shift that.
Great point.
I want to quickly give a shout out to the NYSERDA Real-Time Energy Management Program, because not only does it subsidize the consolidation of data and assets to create a single pane of glass for operators, it also presently provides additional incentives for offices that collaborate with their tenants on energy management. It's no longer eligible for buildings just looking to optimize base building performance. You now need to integrate tenant equipment and sub-metering and a few other requirements in order to unlock the cost share to de-risk your projects.
You guys ready for the next one? So we have a pretty dovetail question, and it's talking about in a pseudo post-pandemic world, offices are being utilized less than ever. So how are we measuring the greenness of office spaces? Are they or buildings? Are they being measured per hour of utility or per hour of existence? Because this is a big picture measurement that we're ultimately looking for. How are people tackling it? It may be still a little bit of a gray area.
So I think one of the interesting things that the pandemic showed us is that when these buildings emptied out, there were literally maybe 5 people in the building. You have the engineering staff and the property managers, right? The energy consumption didn't go down to 0 or 5%. It went down maybe 40% from 100, right? Why would that be? And that's because we discovered, there's a lot of equipment on that is not being used. There are lease requirements that say, regardless of anyone's in a space, provide heating and cooling to it. There's lights that are left on because there's no automatic sensing. There's no daylighting. These things all add up, and we discovered that there's a high base load just because of people's practices and technology. And so I think, I don't think it's necessarily a fundamental change in how we're measuring the greenness of the space so much as we're now aware again of that underlying information. I'm like, oh my goodness, like this is ridiculous that we didn't drop our consumption more than this, right? When the building's completely empty. And so I think we now are more aware of it. Now we can start implementing technology, implementing these overlays, and start really paying attention to zone by zone, how many people are in there, how's the building being used, what are the actual occupancy patterns? Can we maybe anticipate that with some software and start adjusting the building ahead of time to do that? So I think, again, it's just new information that's driving change.
I think it's almost like a lot of people are watching and listening, and they're like, oh, that's painful, that hurts. It hurt all of us just hearing it. But it's kind of this amazing moment. It's such an opportunity, just like everything else in this crazy new life shift that we're experiencing. What an opportunity to shed light and a spotlight on something that we may not have even realized was wasteful.
Yeah, I work with so many companies where their energy consumption did not go down. They were all expecting to see big savings, and it gets down to lease terms. So the building has to be cooled to this temperature. It has to be heated to this temperature, regardless of if it's one person in the building or thousands of people. So there's also ways for us to reinvent our lease terms and expand, reinvigorate what green leases were and change it from just, sharing a couple pieces of data to sharing some energy efficiency projects. So looking at these terms and thinking, does this make sense? Should there be, hopefully never again, another pandemic or some other type of event that we don't go and just use a bunch of energy that's used for absolutely nothing. It kept the chairs and the monitors cool and warm.
So a lot of our industry is really interested in this conversation, but they don't work in sustainability, and they're not on the front lines in the day-to-day like you guys are. Can you explain what a green lease is?
So a green lease is basically when you're negotiating a new lease with the tenant and the landlord, putting in clauses into the leases that promote sharing of best practices, sustainability responsibilities, talking about upfront investments. At a minimum today, we're seeing the data sharing is upfront, particularly given the SEC reporting, but it goes into even just having routine meetings to talk about sustainability, bring in tenant engagement and workplace experience. The interesting part is the federal government, the GSA, I think they have somewhere north of like 40 green lease clauses that they put into their contracts to try to promote that good environmental stewardship. And lots of companies are doing it. I think we're in the early stages of what it could be.
Very cool. Thank you for explaining that.
Add one thing there. In addition to that, which I agree with, is the mutual agreement of certain performance standards in these leases. And it's even actually coming up now under the context of Local Law 97, for example, where building owners are seeing that there's penalties coming that are driven by the occupancy practices of their clients, their customers, right? And so now we're seeing in most leases coming through an awareness of the costs that everyone in the building is going to be exposed to if they don't meet these certain requirements.
Wow.
And so it's not only the tenant and the landlord having their own goals, but now they're also having to make sure that they're mutually working with each other to meet the state and city requirements as well.
Are you guys seeing any kind of movement on this kind of, we'll call it, landlord-occupier relationship as it relates to doing better or maybe sharing some of the burden?
We're definitely seeing more tenant experience platforms being rolled out by owner-operators, and these mobile apps, portals offer new avenues through which to foster collaboration. It's not only the transparency that we've discussed, but you can begin using more tools like gamification to begin unlocking additional benefits from things like demand response and so on. And so I think we're seeing a greater emphasis on this type of collaboration as owners and operators seek to market their spaces in new ways.
What an interesting point of connection between the two that I don't think we've seen too much in terms of collaboration over the years. So I think that that's a really interesting evolving relationship to keep an eye on. Dave, in terms of I'm sorry, did you want to comment on that before we move on?
Yeah, again, probably just echoing the same thing, is that we're seeing more and more data. We're seeing tenant engagement apps come up that we're adopting, and you're seeing essentially what used to be prop tech was its own thing, sustainability tech was its own thing. I think they're on a convergence path that is hitting relatively soon, if not already has, where you'll be in a tenant experience app. We know what the occupancy is. And then using AI and machine learning and all the cool things that I really geek out about, we'll be able to, the building will adapt to the people that are walking into it. So it's the digitalization of the interaction between the human and the building itself, or humans and the building itself. And I think ultimately, again, it's okay, if we know that, can we, get away from peak demand, right? Can we start generating, our own energy within the building? We know who's in the building. We know how they interact with it, and we're trying to work with the occupier to say, this is what you're saving. This is how we're saving. This is great. Like this is where we want to be ultimately, and that goes back to, I think, when you talk about your tenants and ultimately humans saying we want that purpose. We do want to drive towards a greener future, and they sincerely care about that. And bringing that purpose and bringing the landlord in, I think, is great. More communication and more data is always better than less, as far as I'm concerned. So,
on that note, keep that microphone. How can blockchain be a part of measuring this success? How can it play a role? This is one technology in the scheme of technologies that hopefully will help usher in, transparency and measuring.
Yeah, I mean, blockchain. I mean, we could probably have a couple of hour-long conversation on this one, right?
If you're Dave, you can have a couple hour-long conversation on it.
Yeah, I know. I've had many arguments about it and conversations about it. As a technology, I think it's fascinating. I really, really do. I think it will help commercial real estate in the future. I think you have to decouple what is cryptocurrencies and crypto and all of that with blockchain. Blockchain is an unbelievably powerful technology. I think one of the kind of utilities for it in the future will be things like carbon accounting, right? Is putting that on a blockchain so that you do have that chain of information of what was used at any point in time. It's disaggregated. It's reliable. You can go back to any point in time. I think ultimately when we get to a point where, let's say, you're disposing of an asset, someone can go back in time and say, okay, well, this is what you've gone through over time. So carbon credits, I think, would be an interesting one on blockchain. I think with commercial real estate and blockchain, I think there's a whole other world you could get into. Like smart contracts and leases and all that sort of stuff. But I will save everyone a very long conversation. just drop the mic now.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the short-term opportunity is all around the renewable energy and carbon offset mechanisms. There's so many schemes used around the globe. There's different registries. How do you make sure that we aren't double counting those? So whether it's RECs in the U.S. or GEOs, or even looking at the carbon credits themselves, so making sure that we are following those through and not counting them over multiple times.
So I'm gonna echo that, and I'm also. We need to start figuring out how to link our carbon credits with the actual materials. So, I think about our business, and we make very ultra low carbon concrete, and we sell those carbon credits as part of the revenues to bring back to our concrete products producers. And once we do that, that carbon credit is, as you say, disaggregated from the product itself. And so we then sell our masonry to concrete subcontractors who sell it to contractors who sell it to developers. And developers will do their building level EPD, their environmental product declaration. So they're counting up the carbon emissions from their building, and they don't necessarily know, because they've gone through multiple steps of the value chain, whether the block they're using has a carbon credit associated with it or not. Can they count that? Can they financialize? Can they securitize the credit from that block? So I think the blockchain as a public ledger can start to, and I don't know exactly how this is going to work, but we need to figure out how to start to associate it with the material it actually represents.
And it is amazing that we have more and more companies that are tackling this materials aspect of the industry because it's a big one as it relates to this conversation, something I geek out on. So I appreciate that Cindy bears with me with all my million questions and is willing to educate me because I love the building material conversation. It's so important to what's taking place right now.
I actually just wanted to add something that Dave mentioned on the blockchain for carbon accounting. So we're using that now. It's definitely going to be used more in the future, but we just recently completed a purchase for 100% renewable electricity from one of our buildings, and we're using a carbon accounting platform that tracks in real time, hour for hour, the carbon and environmental attributes associated with every megawatt hour of electricity we're using. And one of the attractions for us to the technology is that it is an immutable, auditable trail of information that we can lock in, right? That it has this rich data associated with it that kind of proves that we're doing what we said we were going to do. So it's an accountability tool, it's a transparency tool, and it's only going to be more important, I think.
I think that there's a moment that we need to acknowledge that as Brookfield, you guys are embracing transparency and making, in a real way, because when I started Disrupt CRE 8 years ago, we were talking about data and transparency, and it's like, no landlords want that. That's not gonna happen for a long time. And now here we are, and I'm like having this internal aha moment, like little celebration going on. I'm like, wow, that is amazing. That is amazing.
The biggest thing right now is you want to have legitimacy of your claims, right? Like you don't want to be one of the owners out there who's making a claim and you're not able to back it up. So we have fully embraced that because we want to show that we are doing what we said we're going to do, that we've made this big public commitment. We're talking to our investors, our tenants, our owners about this. We're going to show it.
I love it. I love it. This conversation makes me so happy.
This is great. I wholly agree with all of the audit-proof accounting use cases. I'm hopeful, though, that a throwback blockchain use case will have its day soon, at some point, maybe.
A throwback.
I would love to see some leading owners embrace fractional ownership.
Oh, interesting.
Because if you were able to, let's say, get a fractional share for every coffee you buy in the building, or if you were able to get a piece with every trinket you buy in a gift shop, all of a sudden there might be new ways to motivate action. All of a sudden you might see occupants and users of space much more motivated to participate in sustainability. Very
interesting. Very, very interesting.
Buy 50 million coffees, get a lot.
No, but it is interesting, and kind of this, fractional ownership conversation has been around for as long as I've been doing this, and it's never been quite mature enough to have legs to take off. And we've seen it in some smaller multifamily examples, and we've seen crowdfunding and crossover from that. But yeah, to incentivize occupiers from a ownership standpoint, to care for their building in a different kind of way, it's an idea. It's something to think about. No, I mean that's what this is. This is a lot of ideas, and we've heard some things that are actually happening. But a lot of this conversation is to inspire things to be continue to happen, and for 5 years from now, for people to be remembering this conversation and being like, wow, we talked about that, we heard about that, that sparks something.
I'm sure it'll happen in the metaverse.
In the metaverse, in the office verse.
Yeah, the fractional, stores in the metaverse.
There you go.
As we're selling real estate there.
So I do want to talk about renewals while we're here. What is the state of renewables? Where are we at? What's available? What is the landlord's opportunity? What is the occupier's opportunity? New York City, let's start in New York City and then let's move out.
So we're very fortunate in New York that the state has adopted the policy that it has, because already, if you look at the underlying grid mix, it's probably about 50% carbon free. I mean, you have a mix of nuclear and renewable already that makes it already a good place to draw electricity from. And then if they actually achieve the goals that they've laid out, the 70% renewable by 2030, the 100% zero emissions by 2040, that's great, because what that means for us as electricity consumers, that the electricity that we're using will have essentially, ultimately, zero carbon emissions associated with it. In the interim, as a buyer of renewable energy, there are mechanisms within New York that you can contract directly with power plant owners to say, I want a certain amount of that capacity and I want to apply it just to my building. And that's also a somewhat unique structure that doesn't exist everywhere in all these markets. And then I'd say the third thing about New York that's great is, we have a pipeline of new development that is amazing. I mean, there's so much new stuff coming online that I think that's inspiring. To kind of expand how that looks more US-wide, I think that if you were to look at like the DC region, we're very active there. That's probably similar to New York, and they actually have even more aggressive goals for the mix of their underlying grid.
Amazing.
I'd say if you looked at Texas, it's the opposite. They have probably one of the nation's lowest standards for their grid mix, but there's also abundant opportunity there to do brand new solar and wind projects where you could do a physical power purchase agreement with a group of properties or even a single property and sign up for all that capacity. So there's opportunities there even if the policy isn't catching up. And then I'd say kind of in between, on like the California side, would be, they are aggressive with their goals and there's typically more supply available, but the policy and the red tape has a bit of catching up to do.
Yeah.
I would say the hardest part is it's just particularly in the United States, it's so hard. You have to do it state by state. It's not the same. If you're in the Southeast, your opportunities are very limited. In the Northwest as well. So for companies that have large real estate portfolios where they are the tenant, they're often, trying to, piecework something together to get to their strategies. So it's a challenge. There's organizations that are out there that are trying to shift this, but given our, energy markets in the United States, it makes it really challenging for companies with large national portfolios to get to their goals. Particularly, when they're not on like the massive scale of some like the tech companies that can go out and make these big power purchase agreements. The virtual power purchase agreements have gained traction, but they are, for a lot of CFOs, the financial cash flow implications are sometimes hard for them to swallow. So it's usually a deterrent because, 1 month you could be getting a $400,000 check, the next you could be writing $1 million check, and it's all over the place. And CFOs don't like that financial instability. So there has to be a better way to somehow, enable companies to do it more seamlessly around the country. Because right now it's pretty labor intensive and it's location by location in many cases.
Anybody else want to give us the New York to bigger picture?
One important part to point out as it relates to New York State in particular is within the aggressive renewable energy goals for solar and wind in particular, there's also energy storage goals. And so ideally, by 2030, we'll have thousands of megawatts of storage capacity so that we can help make it easier for end users to benefit from renewable energy. But fingers crossed, I'm also hopeful that we will collectively agree that nuclear energy is renewable and that we should do more of that.
How you just slipped that in. Casual, just a casual little thing. You said by 2030?
Yes.
Okay. And you think technology is at a place right now that by 2030 we're going to have the capacity to have almost like battery storage to that extent for a commercial building? In your expert opinion, Ryan?
So for a commercial building, it's going to be very, very challenging, particularly when you think about how often lithium-ion batteries can explode in the use case like your cell phone. And so I think it's much easier to think about this in terms of utility scale storage options, because there is some potential given existing chemistries, given advancements in things like phase change technologies, that a utility could implement energy storage that ends up benefiting commercial buildings, albeit, again, very difficult to envision commercial assets in New York City getting their own large-scale storage by 2030.
You know what? A lot of the things that are happening right now were probably incredibly hard to imagine 8 years ago. So 8 years is a long time, especially with how quickly things are changing and how many people care about this conversation.
I think just to underscore Ryan's point about the nuclear, though, I think, for a long time, people have viewed that as an absolute, like, let's not go there, let's shut down these plants. And now they're starting to realize that, by shutting down Indian Point, we actually shot ourselves in the foot, because what had to pick up that load? The natural gas plants. So if you're thinking about ways that we can actually have a stable zero carbon base load on the grid, it's going to be nuclear until the battery technology matures enough. But that's the only zero carbon, source of energy that can kind of couple with the wind and power and everything from an intermittency perspective to deliver reliable grid mix. And I think a lot of people are now starting to look at existing facilities and say, can we extend their life? Can we repower them? Can we maybe take another look at the value that they add to the grid?
Did either one of you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm only going to speak to maybe what we've looked at. We've done a lot of work recently on the industrial side. Obviously, you've got huge million-square-foot rooftops, so we're investing heavily and working towards a lot of solar on top of those, which I think is really interesting. We're seeing that from our occupiers. They are looking for renewable when it comes to scope 1 through 3, especially on the industrial side of the world, which I think is really interesting. Another one around the kind of battery storage, which I really like, and might go on a tangent here, so you'll forgive me. I'm kind of intrigued at the interrelationship between EVs and buildings. As we've seen with the Ford F-150 Lightning, right? That will power at home more than likely. You will bring it to an office or to your place of work. And should there be peak demand, should there be something like that, they can draw from that. It will understand how much battery you have left. It understands your commute. So I'm wondering, as we are driving around or going towards a world we drive around in mobile batteries, do we see a world where, okay, we don't have commercial grade batteries within the building, but we do have 250, 350 EVs, which are essentially batteries within that building, and what's the interrelationship there? So I think there's kind of an interesting world there, but I think from our side, we're certainly striving towards that.
We started piloting that about 5 years ago when I was at PG&E, is using batteries to put excess capacity, when you had excess onto the cars, and then when you needed it. And then the other thing is the second life of batteries of cars. You can stack those up and create potentially utility scale or building scale, because no one knows what to do with them at the end of life, and they're still going to have a lot of useful life left to them. They're just not going to be reliable enough for transportation.
Super interesting.
I love that you guys brought this up. This is something that popped into a conversation maybe about 5 years ago at a Disrupt CRE, and it was this very futuristic, maybe that could happen one day, but it was just a small blip on the radar in the conversation. So I love that you brought that up. It's so interesting. You definitely need to be keeping an eye on something like that. I love also, it's just it's an out-of-the-box way of thinking about things, and that's what this is about. I mean, Disrupt's area, we've always talked a lot about technology, but technology is just the tool. It's the creativity of all of you guys as decision makers and implementers and people who are able to create the world around us. So I love that. Thank you for bringing that up. So we have a little bit going on with the renewable conversation. We have a lot of differences around the country and, of course, around the world and how people are tackling this. But in our prep call, we did talk a lot about the differences between East and West Coast, not just from a renewable standpoint, but from an overall sustainability goals standpoint and initiative standpoint. So I do want to highlight that because there are a few of you who can really touch on what are the major differences coast to coast, and not only challenges, but maybe successes as well.
Well, I think you tackled it. There are some policy changes in California, but when you stack their renewables, their large hydropower, their nuclear, they're at 90% carbon-free power in big portions of the state. So they've done a lot. There's definitely more that they can do. They also have a lot of the West Coast has a milder climate. They don't use as much heating oil or natural gas. So electrifying to decarbonize is also really plausible strategy, more plausible than New York City and other places. So there are definitely differences on the coast. Outside of the energy space, I also see it popping up, particularly in the western half of the United States, water. I mean, our clients are as equally focused on water issues and trying to be water neutral, water positive, as they are on their decarbonization strategies, particularly as the state just passed in California that you cannot water lawn for industrial, commercial, or institutional purposes if it has no recreational value. So we're seeing, a ban on water use for that purpose. So our clients are definitely, really embracing that, and it's being complemented at a very local level with some, regulations and policies that you have to, adhere to.
So from a water standpoint, although maybe we don't suffer immediately right now with the same issues, this is an issue that will be, all of our problems soon enough, and it's certainly an issue around the world. How are your clients handling that?
I'd say it's, I'm seeing them handle it very well on the new construction side. So as they are building new, you're seeing companies come out with, water positive or, water neutral by investing in on-site infrastructure to treat. They're harvesting rainwater. They're doing lots of creative things. Where I'm seeing companies struggle is on the retrofit. And that's where they're really, really struggling. There's significant advances. You're also seeing people look to design, in addition to like net zero carbon, net zero water data centers, they're also a huge water hog. So I'm seeing it very positively on the new construction front. It's the retrofit I think everybody's trying to tackle right now, and they're struggling, to be honest.
I think this is a part of the conversation that gets left out too often. I do want.
Question.
Yeah, please.
Mike, I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you all are blurring the line between new construction and whole building retrofit, because you all are definitely doing a lot of things that I didn't think could get done.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things we think very intensely about is the embodied carbon aspect about redevelopment. And so we look at buildings like 5 Manhattan West, like 665th Avenue here in New York, are prime examples where, we could have leveled those buildings and bought and built something different, and it would have been a different product, and it would have had different, operating characteristics and everything. But the amount of carbon that you save by redeveloping an existing building, upgrading its existing infrastructure, is amazing. Like it's huge. And so we think about that very significantly in terms of the overall life cycle of those properties.
That's amazing. So how are you calculating potential emissions when you're building?
Yeah. So one is definitely understanding the carbon, related aspects about the materials that we buy. And I think there are good tools out there available now where you can assess that going in terms of where you buy it from, what it took to actually make it. And then I think even ahead of that, though, is first the design element. Like up front that you can design a building to have gas infrastructure or electric infrastructure. And one of the ways that the West Coast is leading, back to that point real quick, is like they've actually been more aggressive on the gas bans, for example. And New York has just recently joined that effort. But from our design development perspective, now we start thinking completely differently about how we're designing our buildings and saying, if we're going to buy and build an all-electric building, it has very different considerations, very different associated carbon emissions considerations. And we can measure that. It's more of a planning and design and execution point at this stage.
And you had brought up a great resource as it relates to calculating emissions, and I think was it buildingtransparency.org?
Yeah.
We're going to share that one.
Yeah, good.
Because it's come up, I think we talked about it also. So there are more and more resources that are becoming available, but I know that also technology is playing a huge role. So I want to bring up digital twins for a hot second here. And I think sometimes in our industry, especially with the introduction of the metaverse just into culture, people look at digital twins and they're like, that's kind of like, the metaverse. Is it really is it being used? Is it too expensive? Is it actually a good replacement for what we were doing before? So talk to me about the state of things. Dave, do you want to kick it off from a digital twin standpoint?
Sure.
Cool.
Different take on digital twins,
okay.
But one, my kind of bone to pick with digital twins is that they mean so many things to so many people.
So true.
So when you say, I've got a digital twin, okay, is that an architectural one? Is that one for heating and electricity? Is that one is it just a 3D model? Is it like a BIM model? Or in other cases, it's, everything, right? It's all things involved. It is an actual digital representation of a living, breathing building, right? It takes in tenant experience, it takes in water, it takes in the utility metering, and it is an actual living, breathing model, in which case I think they're fantastic and will have a longer term future without question. I think ultimately they may end up as like a digital passport. Right? You're trading buildings, you're trading whatever. Someone will say, well, show me the digital twin with the last 10 years of records on it. And they'll go back through it like trading a baseball or football player. I'm not as good as American sports, but I presume you get the gist.
That's okay.
But I think the one thing that is challenging, I think, is the cost. I think they are quite expensive now. They are going to get cheaper, no question. I think that's just kind of Moore's law. But certainly right now they're expensive to go with the soup to nuts kind of digital twin as a technology. Yeah, I think it's really interesting and will be one that people will adopt more and more. But again, I always hazard when someone says, we've got a digital twin. It's
Sure.
like, well,
it could mean a million things.
What does that mean for you? Because depending on who you're talking to, they're like, no,
Right.
you don't. So.
And depending on the need that brought about the development of that digital twin, could be so many different things. Anybody want to jump in on the digital twin side now?
The thing that I think is going to be really important with the digital twins is as we get to the place where we're designing net zero assets, you can design a net zero asset, but then you have to operate it in a net zero fashion as well. And you see a big disconnect between the two. And I think having the digital twin on how it was originally designed and what the original operating parameters were assumed, and then you go into the actual operation and having it live with the building, I think is going to be really important. And again, when I think of net zero, I'm not just thinking carbon, I'm thinking water, zero waste to landfill. How do we think about this holistically for the building? So you see clients are definitely starting to adopt it, particularly when it's for new assets. But I think when we get to that net zero world where that's what everybody's designing to, it's going to be really important.
I think it makes sense that we'd be using this asset as part of the overall spend when we're building new, right? Because it only makes sense to have data from day one and build layers, right, through operations and occupancy.
Yeah, and BIM, they've now, I don't know how many dimensions they're up to in BIM, but one of them is around sustainability. So you can look at what is not just the embodied carbon, but what you think the operational carbon is going to be.
Wow.
So they've made, there's definitely progress out there. And I think the key thing is now is going to be that transition. You have a lot that happens from a design phase, but then the ongoing operations. And if we're able to design assets that live longer and we get away from being in a disposable economy, you would want to have that digital record that lives with it.
Sure, yeah. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Please. I was going to add that one of the other, we're running a digital twin in some of our new properties. And we're exploring the full-up option where we have a visual interface of the entire building. We've mapped every single piece of equipment as an asset within the digital twin.
Beautiful.
And I think one of the things that's already proving out to be value-wise is actually just a useful tool for the engineers who support the properties. So like they can literally walk around with a tablet or a phone when they're doing maintenance and look at the status of a particular piece of equipment and see how it's performing, record maintenance actions in real time that gets centrally recorded. And like you said, you'll have a full record of how that building was actually maintained, which is going to enhance value, I think, from an owner perspective, because when you do sell that eventually, or if you try to bring in an investor, for example, you're going to be able to say, look, here again is proof that we're managing this responsibly as Class A owners.
Wow.
And you can trust that we did it because here it is, right? And I think the other piece that we're looking to test out eventually is, can you use that rich data and the history of everything that you've done with the building, the occupancy, the weather, all the stuff that you can overlay onto that data to project future performance in a way that you weren't able to before, just because you have so many more data points. You can layer on some of the AI machine learning components to it. And then, for example, when you're forecasting your energy requirements, you're able to budget much more effectively. You have a much more accurate projection of your income, and that helps you value your property more effectively.
I think this is one of the cool things about, I'll bring up the metaverse again. I know it's like, metaverse. But I think this is one of the cool things that I hope to see develop, aside from just making this kind of technology less expensive because it's going to be available more regularly to more people, trying things and modeling things and seeing how it actually plays out in these environments, maybe being able to mitigate risk for variables that were traditionally unknown, and seeing into the future and making those predictions, hopefully. So I want to keep going down this tech avenue because, of course, I do. But I want to ask you guys, what is the technology, or maybe it's just an industry development that could have the most profound breakthrough in pushing this forward? Like, is there a technology or a policy or a lease agreement? What is that profound thing that could push us light years ahead? Maybe not light years. I know that's asking a lot.
Two right off the bat.
Oh, awesome. Let's go.
One is definitely the battery technology.
Yeah.
I think the battery technology, figuring that out is going to absolutely transform the industry, and to the point where we could have on-site batteries that are safe, that are able to take the entire load. We can do demand and response, and we can lower our energy pull from the grid. I mean, having that technology mature is going to be definitely transformative. And then the second that I would add in there, in line with the comments I made about the transparency component, is the data of the underlying grid mix. So I'll tell you, for our carbon emissions planning, we're relying on grid mix data that is way too old. I mean, years old. And
wow.
That stuff doesn't come out often enough, and you have to be very careful about which market you're in and how far you can look back and when, in terms of what the actual grid mix was that you're using. And so, that's going to inform how you purchase your electricity going forward. It's going to inform how you actually calculate your carbon emissions. And if you're using data that's 2 years old, that is not acceptable.
So how do we get to the more
So
real-time
part
data?
of it is there's meters that you can put on all the power plants, for example, that actually read hourly data that say, okay, at this particular hour, and this is nice sort of territory, so I'm definitely out of my depth here, but we need that information publicly and as consumers to say, our grid as of this hour of this day is composed of this mix, and it has this associated carbon emissions coefficient attached to it.
Building on that one, I think is actually interesting. The emissions factors that come out in the U.S. from EPA are always a year in arrear. They're now putting them out every year. It used to be every 3 years. So yes, getting those emissions factors. And I'm hoping the impetus for this will actually be the SEC reporting requirements. Companies are now going to have to report as part of their 10K. A lot of companies are putting those out at the end of January, early February. So EPA is going to have to change to enable that. Otherwise, we're going to be reporting with emissions factors that are even further in the rear if we don't figure this out and change. But this is part of the ongoing thing we're seeing, which is we're moving from everybody used to report on an annual basis. You've spent 6 months pulling all this data together across all your non-financial metrics. Now companies are looking at it real time, monthly, quarterly, because it's rolling up. It's impacting executive compensation. So hopefully we're going to get to the place where EPA and others are going to catch up and realize that this is not a one and done, once a year. We got to get a lot better. So I'm feeling optimistic. I don't know why.
I love that. No.
It's EPA, but
no, we need to feel optimistic.
I do think it's important. We spend a lot of time tracking down emissions factors. Also, they should be publicly available. Nobody should have to pay for them. Consultants are making a lot of money off of going and tracking these down. I used to be one of them, telling utilities around the country to get their emissions factors. So there's definitely a way for this to be better.
Oh, that sounds brutal. Truly, feels like we can do better.
Those are really strong answers. Mad I didn't go first. I'm going to try and answer it slightly differently with that in mind. And so I think something novel today that's easier for owners and operators than ever before is thinking in terms of thermal inertia. And so there are a lot of technologies for metering and control that have existed for 40 plus years, but that haven't truly been used to their peak potential because we've had a very responsive approach to heating and cooling our buildings. But now, I think we're seeing slowly but surely, particularly with all electric new construction as an example, buildings are moving towards thinking more about their ambient conditions, pursuing systems that are more modular, that are more disaggregated. So, for example, ventilation can be handled separately from heating and cooling to help maximize things like outdoor air circulation within buildings. I think that type of approach to existing assets is going to help more owners hit their carbon goals in the long term.
So yes, I'm going to make, this is kind of a pet thing of mine, but I think that our city streets are the sort of core unit of measurement for, well, I don't know if it's the core unit of measurement, but they're the most important thing to decarbonize so that we can open all our windows on the first 6 floors of a building. So actually, if we can make our streets clean and quiet and green, then we don't actually have to, 3/4 of the year, we can probably just live indoors, outdoors. So it's a little bit different from what you're saying.
No, I love that answer.
I do. I love it too. The honking.
Crazy.
Noise pollution is
Yeah.
different
Noise,
altogether. Yeah, that's a different roundtable altogether.
Yeah, I love that answer, to be honest.
Dave, give us the magical solution. Yeah.
Solution. I don't think you're going to get rid of Teslas having horns, but I think, we'll try. I'd like to get rid of them.
We can get rid of cars then.
That's what she's getting at.
That's where I'm going.
Yeah.
I'm going to get rid of cars.
City bikes with
Rezoning
bells.
for lack of.
You're still going to have a bell.
Cargo bikes. I mean, I can live with bells.
Bells are cool. You can do that.
Yeah, I mean, additive to your point, I think one of the things that will propel this, right, it comes down to like data, right, and what will help propel that, I think, will be 5G. You're going to have IoT sensors on practically everything, and that has its own issues, but I think the advent of more prevalent 5G will help with that. You get data more quickly. It will be on a daily basis that you get readings. It won't be quarterly or yearly, which I think those days have passed from even consumers. It's like, I'm going to check my bank balance quarterly. That's not a thing. So I think 5G will help with that. I completely agree. I think batteries are a huge, huge component to this as well. But yeah, I think they're the two, I think, that will be drivers for the next few years for sure.
I'm not done picking on you. So
Excellent.
I want the picture that's in your brain of this amazing sustainable building that exists in the future. The one of your dreams. What does it look like? What is the tech stack? How does it work?
We've got a great roundtable to give you an answer on that.
I know. And you
I
guys can fill in.
I
I want a collective imagination, but we'll start with Dave.
Yeah, I kind of go back to a building being a cottage industry or like a village of maybe times past. Like I do see a world where it's just, it is running on renewable energy. It can generate its own electricity, whether that's from solar or solar on the window panels. I think it will have battery storage. I think, the access or collecting of rainwater. Could we have hydroponic farms in the basements? Absolutely. Yeah, we could. Could you grow your own food in a basement that is unleasable space? Yeah, I think so. I mean,
It's happening now.
power is the issue now, but if it's all renewable, then yes, you absolutely could. And then you start bringing into a different world where, okay, people interact with the building, you have tenants that are engaged with, we're making honey on the roof. The roof also generates electricity, and in the basement, I'm going to get a caprese. So, it's kind of an interesting world where, I think it is it's digitization of both interaction of humans with the building, but also the building becoming more of a living, breathing thing. Can it not be a drain of the resources around it, but actually be a resource itself? I'll hand it over to the rest of the far more knowledgeable people on this.
No, that's a beautiful image of what we hope, aspire to have in the future.
So I'm going to add to that. I completely agree with everything you said. I'll add that the building and its neighborhood should be, entirely green as well. So it should be on a pedestrian street with a full tree canopy, and e-cargo bikes should be doing the last mile deliveries. I love the idea that we can get our building materials to a point where the buildings can actually breathe in, right? Where they're actually inhaling carbon dioxide, where they're making our air cleaner instead of the opposite. And we're getting pretty close. We can do ultra low carbon concrete, and we're starting to tip over to be able to do carbon negative concrete. I don't know exactly where the state of the market is with steel, but
Greening.
We're getting there.
It's greening. I love that.
So if we can, and there's an opportunity to continue carbonating, right? To continue having the buildings sort of interact with the air around them
and become sort of direct air capture facilities themselves.
Beautiful.
That would be cool.
Can you tell that Cindy has a background in zoning and urban planning?
I'm a little bit biased here, as I'm a native New Yorker who grew up in a 50-story apartment building. And so critically important in envisioning this future for me is that we build more 100-story plus buildings, because in my humble opinion, there is a scale of new construction that can overcome the embodied carbon associated with demolition. Moreover, at that large scale of development, it becomes much more feasible to begin having conversations around privatizing surrounding infrastructure. It's really hard for a lot of owners to deal with utilities when it comes to things like interconnections, but once you get past a certain scale that's typically reserved for campus-style development, if we can consolidate those efforts into individual development projects, I see much more potential for our buildings to be sustainable, responsive, and ultimately help with reducing other people's emissions, which I think might be their highest and best use.
Can I push back on that a little bit?
This was our debate. This is the debate we got into in the prep. I love it. Let's go.
It's coming. I see things very differently. I think that first and foremost, we need to take our existing building stock and use it 24/7. And so this means taking our empty office buildings and retrofitting them, converting them to be used for residential. It means upzoning our R1 and R2 districts to be R5 and R6, right? So we have the capacity to develop, but I am not sure that very large buildings, 100-story plus buildings, are the most efficient and the most mental health efficient and the most livable. So when you have very tall buildings, you have very wide streets, right? You have to sort of, the way tall buildings interact with their environment means it's very hard to have a livable neighborhood. And if you're gonna do a mixed use neighborhood, and you have super talls in the middle of them, there's not a great way to engage with them. You know, it's hard to have little mom and pop retail at the bottom. It's hard to know your neighbors in a funny way. So I'm gonna, you know, there is a whole movement around strong towns and livable sort of gentle density, which would be the Parisian Barcelona style, you know, 6 to 8 story buildings that are attached, and so you don't lose all the energy between the buildings. And you have courtyards in the back and pedestrian streets in the front, and it's a great way to live. So there you go.
So we did get into a lot of this, you know, traditional underutilization of office space, which we've certainly had since pre-pandemic, and potentially reusing some of that dead time for something else, be it conversion to multifamily, urban agriculture, recreation, who knows? This is where our creativity can come into play, and whoever's watching, your creativity can come into play, and I hope it will. And I don't want to spend too much time because I do have one final question that I do want to get to, but I want to give you guys a chance on this side to respond.
So one of the ways I can have a vision of a perfectly sustainable building, say facade technology matures to the point where the entire building's facade is generating power, where the windows are generating power and they automatically dim throughout the day based on where the sun is and how the clouds are. I think that's going to go a long way already. I think there's ways that you could design the HVAC infrastructure internally where maybe the side of the building that's not facing the sun is not running, whereas the side that is facing the sun is running, and that's automatically changing throughout the day. So a building that truly responds to its environment and is generating through the smart technology as much as it's consuming.
I do love how materials has played a role in all of kind of our dream buildings, and I think that it will be really amazing in our lifetime to see materials advance to such a place where they're smart, and maybe not only they're helping generate energy, but they're also reporting on the data that it's using, and it can be you know, piece of technology that's enabling connectivity and entertainment and community, and who knows? So this is cool. We get to have this awesome conversation in 2022 and look into a very optimistic, hopeful future. So with that, we've got 10 and 12 minutes to tackle some thoughts for the next generation, because we're all really privileged to be sitting here and be able to contribute to the built world around us in this kind of amazing way, and contribute to just even having this conversation is doing amazing work. So when I think about the next generation, unlike the corporate real estate and office roundtable that we just had, and I said, nobody wakes up, when they're, thinking about what they want to be when they're younger and says, I want to be a workplace strategist or a corporate real estate professional. And I said, if you are out there and listening, let me know. I want to meet you. But a lot of people, and especially the next generation, are really into climate action, sustainability, but I don't think enough of our next generation realizes the impact that the built world has on the environment. To be totally honest, when I started Disrupt CRE, I had no idea, and it's the thing that made me choose this industry out of college. And it's the purpose that's continued to drive me to be in this space and work in this space, as all of you, are similar sitting here. But so when we think about asking the next generation to come spend their energy and talent with us in this industry, what's your advice? What's your best advice? I know this is probably the most loaded question I gave.
I'll kick it off. So I would say, so one of the pieces of advice I heard early in my education was to follow your passion. And I think that among people who are entering into the workforce now, there's probably a lot of pressure to say, going to follow the banking track, the consulting track, the lawyer, the accounting track, right? That's great if that's where your curiosity really lies, but I think for too many people, they're doing that because that's what's expected of them, or there's a proven path there. They don't have to blaze a new path. I think now it's ripe for people to really follow where their curiosity leads them. And prime example, like my job didn't exist a year ago, and only by virtue of me saying like, oh, I'm kind of curious about how our buildings get energy. I'm curious about that. Did they say like, well, good, because you're going to do that now.
That's amazing.
So, really just focusing on what draws your curiosity, what you read in the newspaper, whether you read online on these blogs, like what kind of videos, what books you're interested in, what movies, like those will inform where your curiosity lies, and that drives you, gives you energy, and I think that's worth paying attention to.
So this is not a big scary industry that there's this massive barrier to entry specifically as it relates to sustainability. It's a brand new thing in a lot of cases that's just existing and becoming important right now. So just like we were talking about office strategy, it's not the same old thing. We're starting new. We're starting new right now. And so there's every opportunity to be involved, and it might take some persistence and patience in figuring out what your mode of entry will be. But it's available and it's here, and we're encouraging you to please spend your talent with us in this industry.
Well, we have talked about a lot of technical or environmental topics today. The part that I love about sustainability is the people element. It's a way to connect to people. It underlies so much as the social elements of this. When we talk about renewable energy, we're also talking about the equity that it brings, so that you're not bringing it a bunch disproportionately to lower income populations. So there's this whole, undertone of social and people. So you don't have to be like a technology wonk, or you don't have to be, really into engineering or details. There's career paths for everybody in a variety of disciplines. And you can, in many cases, choose your own adventure and find something that you're passionate about and shape a role that you want to have.
I love that.
I'll add too that the smartest people I know have quit their jobs and moved into sustainability.
Wow.
So it's, if you want to find smart colleagues, go and work in this space, because it's incredibly interesting. It's incredibly deep. It's incredibly technical, but it doesn't have to be. Yeah. So I'll also say, actually, another note is that the smart money is going into sustainability. And so even when you look at economic collapse, you may see a lot of stocks drop. You may see a lot of companies not get funded. What has not dropped is climate tech. So there's a lot of resiliency in this space.
And I think there's a lot of new dollars being allocated to this space, just like we saw a few years ago, brand new dollars being allocated to prop tech, right? And when it's landlord driven, it's even better. I mean, that's the ultimate, what we could hope for to see happen.
Yeah, and the problem is only going to become more and more visible. And so the dollars aren't going away.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I can add to that a little bit. I think as regards the next generation, I think they're probably more sophisticated than I was at their generation as regards like people showing up in coffee shops with their own cups and metal straws and all this sort of stuff, like those little incremental changes that I've seen working in prop tech. I was working with people younger than I, and they're already kind of there. And similar to what you said with prop tech a couple of years ago in 2013, 14, it wasn't really a thing.
Right.
And similar to your point, was my role a thing 4 or 5 years ago? No. So I think you're seeing that progression happen. I think people are interested in that world, but real estate wasn't always front of mind. And I think as you become in our roles, I suppose, on an educational standpoint, to say, hold on, real estate is literally everywhere, right? You interact with it all the time. It impacts your day-to-day so much that once that kind of spark happens between the two, I think you'll see people move into it more. Not that they have maybe a real estate background or even like an ESG background. Maybe it's just tech, but they didn't realize they can connect those dots together for a role that they're super passionate about. And again, people are looking for that purpose and that drive. I would just say from our standpoint, it's about attracting those people that maybe traditionally weren't involved in real estate, but I think we can draw them in. It's not maybe the maybe stuffy old appearance that it once had. That it is a changing and evolving, and I think we're rapidly evolving. Like I said, 10 years ago, prop tech not really a thing. Now we're talking about carbon on blockchain, right? So we're certainly evolving rapidly and need to do so. So I think just making people aware that it is a thing. But I think they're already involved in the environmental side. I think far more sophisticated, certainly, than I was.
I think from a consumer standpoint, I think a lot of people, especially young people, care about sustainability, but maybe their focus is on more like, as a consumer, how can I be more green, which is beautiful. But I think people don't realize this big picture where we all get to see it every day, where they could really, for me, it's so purposeful, just even making conversations. I don't even get to do what you guys do, and I just get to make the conversations, and I feel great purpose. So I think bringing awareness to the level of impact that we have on carbon emissions as an industry, attributed to commercial real estate and construction waste, the more we can do that, the more we can bring light to it, I think is helpful.
I'll echo everything everyone just said. All great advice. I will add that if you are unsure of how to approach the industry, can't get any introductions, but want to pick some technical skills that will hopefully help you transition into sustainability in real estate, I highly recommend mechanical engineering and cybersecurity. Those are two sectors that will become increasingly important to real estate operations, and so insofar as you can start collecting your certifications, your awards, and so on, I think that will be very helpful. And I'll just end with, don't wait to be great.
Don't wait to be great. I love that.
And study materials science.
Material science. And it doesn't mean you have to necessarily study those things in school. I am totally self-taught. I've been learning at the front lines, and I'm still a student after 8 years of running events and hosting, but I get to talk to amazing people every day. Cindy, I've been learning from for a long time. And I think that there's more information out there than ever before. It's free, every single, whether it's a tech company, a developer, a brokerage firm. NYSERDA, we all have content that's being put out there all the time. So mechanical engineering is amazing. Yes, we need you if you're mechanical engineering, but you can also be an entrepreneur. You can be a content creator, a storyteller. You can be a connector. You can be a consultant. You can build skyscrapers. So I think for the next generation, the sky's the limit. Anybody want to add anything? I think we did a really great job. We got a lot of stuff going on.
Well, I would just like to add thanks to Marielle for bringing us all together.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And the real impact that you'll have here beyond, I think, the live stream is that we're all going to go out for drinks and we're all going to figure out how to work together.
Yeah.
And so, it's important what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I actually have one last question since we have a minute. Where are you guys? What is the mediums that you're looking at information? Are you guys listening to podcasts? Do you enjoy videos on YouTube? And it might not be industry content specific, but where are you consuming information? Podcasts, yeah. Podcasts, okay.
I'd say audiobooks too. Like
Audiobooks.
I listened to a lot of the recent ones, Speed and Scale by John Doerr. I mean, the Bill Gates book about climate. I mean, there's a lot of good, deep research going on about climate right now. I'd recommend Daniel Yergin, Vaclav Smil. Like, these people have gone deep into the energy markets and the world and how these things work. And so, there's a lot of current content being generated, and I definitely listen to a lot of podcasts. But don't forget that the books that are thoroughly researched and are out there, they're a little harder to access necessarily, but amazing source of information.
Awesome.
Yeah, one of my favorite podcasts is the Energy Transition Show, which then gives me books that I can then go and read. So it brings a lot of great things together. But that's a good one for people who are really interested in renewable energy, storage, and other topics.
Can you say that one again?
The Energy Transition Show.
Beautiful.
I'll also shout out James Dice's podcast, Nexus Labs. They do an exceptional job demystifying building and climate-related technologies, helping folks understand what leaders in the industry are actually doing. Also, YouTube is your friend.
Yes, amazing.
Finally, I would say if you're a layperson and trying to learn more about sustainability, the book Drawdown is really great at just saying, here are the high impact things you can do, here's how much those things cost, and the sort of likelihood that they're going to be able to scale in the next 50 years. So it's a really great way to say, all right, here's how I want to focus my time.
You be able to share?
I suppose adding on that, you've nailed most of them that I was going to bring up. But I'm a huge fan of newsletters, subscriptions of newsletters to your emails, right? And more often than not, people generate those on a weekly, monthly basis of where's the money going, right? Whether that's a VC newsletter or elsewhere. There is always a portion, ever increasing portion around sustainability and ESG topics. So just even subscribing to some of these things, I find them super helpful in the morning just to scroll through some of those when I don't have the time for a podcast or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you guys for giving me that little bonus content. I appreciate that. I know our audience will appreciate it. So thank you all. If you're still with us after 90 minutes, we will make this available for anybody who did miss it. So thank you guys. Thank all of you for being here. And I think that's a wrap.